I've got a theory that a method used to critique 19th century romantic poetry could be useful in helping us understand 21st century watch design. Stick with me and see if these ideas got any legs. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. A sticking point with me has always been, how do we talk about the influence of past designs on current day watches? In the watch community, we have this big sledgehammer, this blunt instrument called the word homage, and it tends to flatten all nuance, all useful discussion about the realities of the design process. And I've been trying to find an alternative way forward. What I stumbled upon was, coming through the world of English literature, a book written by a guy by the name of Harold Bloom, one of the foremost, certainly in English, literature critics of today. He wrote a book called The Anxiety of Influence, and that was written around, he was trying to find a new method of critiquing 19th century romantic poetry. And so he wrote this book, and it's a very simple theory. There's really only 4 parts to it. The first is that no poem is original. Every single poem that someone writes is written by someone who has read other poetry, who is therefore influenced by the ideas, and that therefore nothing can be truly original. The second point is, that's no bad thing. We recognize that that's going to happen, but that many design and all poets know that this is the circumstance. And the issue isn't whether they are influenced, it's how they respond to that influence. And in particular, most designers or most poets get anxious about how to deal with these influences, and that anxiety of how to deal with the influences that are inevitable from your predecessors really dictates whether you are a strong poet or a weak poet. Which then brings us to the last 2 points, which is really about saying we're not assessing a poet, in Harold Bloom's case, he's not assessing a poet in terms of their originality, but rather their strength. A strong poet can take the inevitable influences of the past and shape them in their way, to make their thing, to make their poem. They could even, despite taking allusions and ideas from former poems, they could actually even transcend the originals and come up with something that's wholly original and with its own story, its own song, if you like, despite the fact that it has influences from the past. Weak poets, on the other hand, are unable to do that and end up just creating clear derivatives, clear copies. They just end up aping the original rather than creating something new. And so why is this theory, talking about poets and poetry and writing, useful to us? It's because I think we in the watch community is kind of stuck in a bit of a cognitive rut we don't know how to get out of. As I said, we have this kind of blunt instrument called the word homage, which we just impose on every watch that has any kind of passing similarity to another watch. And given that everything has been done before, that basically means every watch kind of gets labelled with the same homage label. Now, that's just not particularly helpful to us, because if you look at multiple watches, you can see that there is a difference between good designs and bad designs, but we don't have a language, we don't have a toolkit necessarily for unpicking this. And I think that's where the anxiety of influence and that theory steps in to help. And so how does this theory, this idea, how would we adapt it? How does it help, and how would we adapt it to our circumstances? The first is that it comforts us, it helps us come to the realization, helps us accept that nothing is original. Pretty much every shape, every curve, every hand treatment, every surface treatment, pretty much everything has been done before. Even if a watch designer can find parts of their watch that may, God forbid, somehow be original, that will be a small component of the overall. The overall watch will inevitably contain multiple influences from multiple other sources. So the first thing that the anxiety of influence theory gives us is comfort to accept that reality. The next thing it does is it says, having accepted that the influence of predecessors is inevitable, it then says, that's okay. That's not a problem. What the issue is not whether there has been influence, but how that influence has been dealt with. How has the designer today taken the influences from the past and then shaped something new? And then it gives us not a binary homage, not homage kind of useless hammer, but rather it gives us a spectrum ranging from incredibly weak to incredibly strong. An incredibly weak design would be your classic Submariner knockoff. There's essentially no design. Someone has sat there and literally copied another designer. At the strongest possible design, you might have someone who can take some ideas from a previous watch that might have been half developed or not entirely resolved, and then coming up with something wholly new despite the fact that the components are perhaps from other places, but as a whole, as a totality, as it's executed, it creates something which is unlike anything else. So you're moving from weak designs which are imitative, which are aping an original, which are clearly derivative, through to really strong designs which, whilst having obvious influences, are very definitely their own thing, very definitely telling their own story, not relying on the fact that whilst they might be using ideas, they're not relying on you recognizing where those ideas have come from in other watches. So as I said, I've been personally struggling with this. I tried to do something similar through a concept of authenticity, saying that an authentic design was one which recognized that there was a past but wasn't constrained by it, that tried to break free from it. The problem is the sheer the connotations of the word authentic kind of lead you to having an overly developed expectation of originality, which just I wasn't good enough, I wasn't articulate enough to get through. I couldn't talk about something that had influences and was authentic. So ditching that design completely, ditching that language completely, and stepping back and saying, let's just talk about where influences have come from, because they all have influences, and then let's just talk about whether the designers ended up with a weak design or a strong design, or where in that spectrum they came. I have personally found that to be a really useful way of thinking about watch design in the 21st century, and with the critiques and the why my watches, and with all of my discussions about watches moving forward, that's the language I'm going to use. I'm going to ditch ideas about originality and authenticity and simply refer to strong and weak designs. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to do. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I've had a sample watch critique, which I have messed with for probably 4 months now. I reckon I have filmed it, watched it, tried to edit it, bin it. Oh God, maybe a dozen times so far. Mainly because I'm finding that the process of doing the critique is kind of like prototyping a product. It's kind of like, it's not until you say it, you put it on the screen, you then try and cut and paste it into a cogent discussion. Do you understand what's going to work and what's not going to work? And one of the things I've really been stumbling over is this whole question of authenticity and originality. I think this tool cut through this, the idea of understanding the anxiety of influence and considering the strength of a design rather than its originality or authenticity is really helpful. In my trials of doing critiques, it works really well. But what do you think? Do you think this isn't going to work? Do you think that it is actually possible to come up with something wholly new that doesn't rely on influences at all from any watch ever in history? How do you think about when watch companies produce things which are stunningly similar to other watches, which maybe look quite different but contain elements which clearly have similarities to other watches? Do you not care? Do you think this is all someone else's problem? Leave your comments below. I really look forward to seeing them. Anyway, I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches, and I'll see you later. Bye.